A chill had settled over Manchester, where the shadows of a phantom killer lurked in every dark corner. 6 murders, each more bizarre than the last, carried a sinister pattern, until one deadly night shattered everything. A twist in the rhythm of death, a clue left behind, and a mind lost in the pursuit of an illusion. Nothing was what it seemed. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was upon a bitter November evening, the streets outside our lodgings soaked in an unrelenting drizzle, that I became acutely aware of the peculiar tension in my friend's demeanour. Holmes sat in his armchair by the fire, the fingertips of each hand pressed together, eyes closed yet most certainly not at rest. There was in his bearing a quiet intensity, like that of a violinist poised a breath before the bow descends. I had known Holmes long enough to recognise such silences not as empty, but rather pregnant with some private storm of thought. The coals hissed faintly in the grate, and the street lamps beyond the window threw pale, wavering reflections upon the panes. I opened my mouth twice to speak, but found I could not disturb the atmosphere that had settled over us. Holmes was waiting for something. Of that I had no doubt. It was thus that the stillness was broken by a firm knock at the door, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice announcing a messenger. Holmes's eyes opened instantly, sharp as a blade unsheathed. A boy entered, cap dripping with rain and boots muddied to the laces. Wordlessly, he handed Holmes a telegram, or what remained of it. The paper was damp, its lower portion torn away, as though in haste or panic. Holmes took it with a curious delicacy, and while the boy stood shifting from foot to foot, he read its contents in a single, silent moment. His face changed not at all, save for the barest contraction of the brow, a movement so slight it might have passed unnoticed by another man. He folded the fragment once, then twice, and placed it upon the table beside him. Still, he did not speak. It was only after the boy had gone that I dared reach for the paper. Holmes made no protest. There, scrawled in a hurried hand across the top half of the page, were 5 words that stirred in me an unexpected chill. There has been a 6th. That was all. No sender's name, no location, not even a signature. And yet I felt the hair rise upon the back of my neck, as though I had looked upon a telegram bearing a death sentence. I glanced at Holmes, who met my gaze with that peculiar gleam which so often accompanied the scent of a case. "Well," I ventured, "it appears someone is counting, though what precisely they are counting remains a mystery." Holmes gave no reply. Instead, Holmes stood and moved to the hearth, the telegram still folded in his hand. "The handwriting is northern," he said softly, with a leftward tilt suggestive of haste rather than carelessness. "The paper bears the imprint of G.H. and Sons, a Manchester stationer." He paused, lifting the damp corner of the telegram to his nose. "Lavender soap, uncommon, faint trace of pipe smoke, charcoal blend, not shag." He turned his eyes upon me with a sudden brightness. "Watson, a solicitor has died in Manchester, or soon shall. Male, likely in his late 40s. Unmarried by the penmanship. There is a hesitancy in the lower loops consistent with an educated but solitary hand." I confess I stared at him. "You derive all that from 5 words." "I derive it," he replied, "from 5 words, a scent, a watermark, and the mud upon the messenger's boots, which you may have noticed carries the reddish tinge of sulphured clay." He turned back to the fire. "Someone is informing us, Watson, but the method suggests both urgency and secrecy. That, above all, intrigues me. I take it," I said slowly, "that this is not the first such message." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "There have been 5 previous murders in as many months, all unsolved, and all in Manchester. each on the 6th day of the month. I had been observing them from a distance. He glanced again at the telegram. This, Watson, would make the 6th. The number hung in the air like a spectre, and though I struggled to grasp its full significance, I could not shake the growing sense that something monstrous was unfolding in silence, far beyond the reach of the London morning papers. Holmes made no further comment. He simply returned to his chair and resumed his earlier posture, waiting. Even now, I cannot explain the peculiar sense of foreboding that settled over me that night. It was not the grim tally that disturbed me, nor even Holmes's eerie certainty, but rather the feeling that we were standing at the edge of something vast, unknowable, and already in motion. The number 6 had become, in that moment, not a mere integer, but a cipher, a dark signature written in breath upon the fog. And though I did not yet know his name, I felt, with a clarity that defied logic, that the hand of the phantom had already reached toward us. It was the following morning, grey and unseasonably chill, when Inspector Tobias Gregson of Scotland Yard was announced at Baker Street. His coat was streaked with road dust, and his face, though habitually impassive, bore the weary tautness of a man who had travelled without pause. Holmes, seated at his customary post near the window, inclined his head slightly but did not rise. "You have come far," he observed. "Manchester," Gregson replied, shedding his gloves with stiff fingers. "And I'd not have come at all, Mr. Holmes, had the matter not demanded the keenest of heads. I'll not waste your time." He opened a leather case and laid out 6 documents, each bearing an official police seal and stamped photograph. Holmes studied them silently as Gregson added, "There have been 6, sir. The first 5 were strange enough, but the 6th, well, that one has shattered the whole city's nerve." Holmes gestured for him to continue. "The first was in June," Gregson began, his voice low. "Middle-aged man found in his study. Strangled, no sign of forced entry. Then again, in July, then August, September, October. 5 months. 5 bodies." He drew out a small envelope and tipped its contents onto the table. 5 torn playing cards. Each bore the 6 of clubs, and each had been ripped diagonally across its face. Holmes picked one up with delicate fingers and held it to the light. "No fingerprints," Gregson said. "No fibres. Always the same card. Always the same method. Strangulation. Bare hands. No weapon. And always on the 6th of the month." I leaned forward, troubled by the symmetry of it. "The 5th man," Gregson continued, "was found at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. I'll not bore you with theories. Some say ritual, some say madman, others think it's a warning of some kind. But no man who's looked upon these cases thinks them unconnected. Nor, I dare say, would you." Holmes returned the card to its envelope, his features unreadable. "And the 6th?" he asked softly. Gregson's jaw tightened. "That's just it, sir. The 6th broke the sequence." He handed Holmes a fresh report, this one bearing the name Eliza Morton. She was a nurse at St. Aldwyn's Infirmary, young, respectable, no enemies. Found strangled in her rooms on the 2nd of November. No 6th of the month. No connection to the other victims, at least none we could see. But he reached into a separate pouch and produced a 6th card. Again, the 6 of clubs, torn like the others. Holmes took it silently and pressed it against the others. The tear matched the others precisely, as though all 6 cards had once been part of the same deck, perhaps even the same hand. Gregson added, "The papers haven't picked up on the break-in rhythm yet. They still think it fits. But I know better, Holmes. The 2nd of November changes everything. Either we've a copycat, or the killer has altered his design." Holmes said nothing, but I could sense a shift in his posture, a subtle tightening of focus. Gregson exhaled heavily. The press have named him the Sixth Phantom, as if the devil himself had donned a cloak and walked among us. People speak of omens, of hexes. You'd think we'd been visited by Jack the Ripper's spectral cousin. He rubbed his temple with weariness. It's not just the deaths, Mr. Holmes. It's the fear. No pattern can be followed, and no motive can be discerned. No witnesses, no sound, just quiet victims, a playing card, and a city that's beginning to lock its doors before sunset. The police commissioner, he continued, has already received 2 letters threatening to resign if the case isn't solved. The public want answers, and the constabulary has none. Holmes regarded the scattered reports for a long moment. Then he leaned back, folding his hands together as though drawing the facts inward. "And what," he murmured, "do we know of Eliza Morton's life?" Gregson hesitated. "Very little, but enough to know that she was the wrong kind of victim, at the wrong time." For several minutes, Holmes remained unmoving, his gaze fixed not upon the cards or the reports, but upon some internal theatre to which none but he held a ticket. I had seen this expression before. Once, notably, just days before the solution to the affair of the Black Veil had come to him in a flash before supper. Gregson, evidently uncomfortable in the prolonged silence, ventured, "It's the change in the date that troubles me most. All else is the same. The card, the method. But that second. Why?" Holmes stirred at last. "Have you considered, Inspector, that the sequence was not broken, but rather completed?" Gregson frowned. "You mean that what we have assumed to be pattern may in fact have been prologue?" The inspector blinked. "That's a devilish way to see it, Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head slightly, and yet the devil, as they say, is very often found in the details. He stood. "You must return to Manchester, Inspector. Make no announcement to the press. Dr. Watson and I will follow you tomorrow by the early train." The matter, it seemed, was decided. As the door closed behind Gregson and his weary boots descended the stairs, Holmes turned toward the fireplace and stirred the coals with the poker. Not out of necessity, I believe, but to mask the inward fire that had already been lit. "It is not the number of murders that troubles me, Watson," he said at last. "It is the narrative being shaped by their arrangement. Someone has designed this, not as a madman acts, erratic and wild, but with a playwright's precision, and I intend to read the final act before he has time to write it." There was in his voice a quiet certainty that I had come to recognize with both admiration and apprehension, for it always preceded our descent into danger. "I shall wire Mrs. Forrester," he said. "She owes me the favour of an unoccupied compartment on tomorrow's morning express." I took up my pen and made note of the day's strange developments. Though the fire glowed warm at my back, I could not shake the feeling that we were walking toward a place where shadows outnumbered men. We departed from Euston by the 7:30 express, the great iron beast bearing us steadily northward through the shifting mists of an overcast morning. Holmes sat opposite me, unmoving and unblinking, his long fingers steepled before him, and his eyes fixed upon some invisible horizon that lay well beyond the fields of Derbyshire. I have grown accustomed to Holmes's silences in such times, and though the habitual chatter of passengers filled the compartment beyond, I knew better than to interrupt the theatre of thought which played behind his eyes. The case had gripped him, that much was plain. Yet there was also a quiet solemnity to his expression, a stillness that hinted at deeper waters, perhaps stirred by the symmetry of the deaths, or perhaps by something yet unseen. For my own part, I spent much of the journey reviewing Gregson's notes. 6 lives snuffed out in as many months, each one stranger than the last, and now a 7th that broke the rhythm, yet deepened the mystery. Holmes did not stir until the train hissed into Manchester's soot-stained station, and even then, he emerged as if from a reverie only half complete and entirely undisturbed. Our first stop upon reaching the city was the small lodging house in Radcliffe Square where Eliza Morton had lived and died. It was a humble, narrow structure pressed between two tobacconists and draped in a melancholy air that clung to the shutters and bricks alike. We were met at the threshold by a stooped woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Mrs. Dallow, the housekeeper and landlady. Her eyes were red from recent tears, but her bearing remained resolute, as if sorrow had long since become a companion. She was a quiet girl, was Eliza, she told us, leading us up the creaking stairs. Clean, punctual, always polite. Never brought trouble to my door, not until that night. Holmes said nothing as we entered the small chamber where the murder had occurred. He glanced once about the room, then turned to the landlady. "You mentioned a visitor." Mrs. Dallow nodded, lowering her voice. "Late the night before she died, a man came asking for her. I heard his voice, soft-spoken, polite, but I watched from the stairwell, I did. He walked with a limp, left no name, just asked if she was in, then vanished down the street." Holmes's eyes flickered with renewed interest. "Did she speak with him?" The woman shook her head. "I don't believe so. She told me nothing of it. And by morning, she was dead." He offered no further questions then, but I knew well the sign. Something in the tale had quickened the pulse of his investigation. Holmes moved about the small room with his usual economy of motion, his eyes sweeping from corner to corner with a dancer's precision. I watched in silence as he crouched beside the modest writing desk, lifted the edge of a fringed carpet, and studied the patterns of dust along the baseboards. It was in these subtleties that his genius thrived. "She was interrupted," he said at last, gesturing toward the unmade bed and the position of the overturned chair, and quickly. No time for a struggle, yet no sign of restraint. Strangled, swiftly, silently, and with purpose. He moved to the dresser and lifted a pale scrap of cloth. "Missing handkerchief," he murmured, "but not by accident. Look, the dust mark." He gestured to a small rectangular absence amid a film of settled grey. Then, leaning toward the vanity, he inhaled gently. "Lavender," he said. "Faint but deliberate. Not hers, I would wager. It lingers only by the door." "Perfume?" I asked. "No," he replied. "Oil, applied, not worn. An actor's scent, used to mask adhesives or prosthetics. Watson, I believe we're dealing not merely with a killer, but a man of the stage." From Eliza Morton's lodgings, we proceeded to Manchester's Central Precinct, where we were received, rather coolly, by Inspector Thomas Mallory, the senior officer assigned to the case. He was a tall, narrow man with a hard-set mouth and eyes that never quite met one's gaze. Though he offered the expected courtesies to Holmes, it was plain from the outset that he did so under some strain of pride. "I don't know what Gregson's told you," he began stiffly, "but we have matters well in hand. The city's in a state, yes, but that's press theatre, not the truth of the investigation." Holmes offered no challenge to the remark. And yet 6 men are dead, and now a 7th. A nurse, unrelated to the others, killed 2 days early. Mallory's mouth twitched. Copycat or panic. Happens in patterns like these. Holmes tilted his head. "Then you see no deeper connection between the victims?" "None worth chasing." Holmes remained silent for a moment. Then, quite gently, he asked, "And were the earlier scenes searched for evidence of disguise? Any trace of grease paint or adhesive residues?" Mallory blinked, then looked away. "We collected what evidence there was," he muttered. Holmes stood. "Inspector, I make no claim upon your authority, but if you intend to resolve this affair with dignity, I suggest you widen your scope. This is no frenzy. It is theatre." Mallory's jaw stiffened, but he said nothing more. As we left, I glanced back to see his fingers clenching slowly into fists behind his desk. From the precinct, we proceeded to the offices of the Manchester Herald, a modest establishment in St Anselm's Square, where we were met by Mr. Dorian Field, the journalist whose byline had become synonymous with the phrase "the sixth phantom." He was a wiry man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that gleamed with restless energy, as though he existed in a state of perpetual anticipation. "An honour, Mr. Holmes, truly," he said, pumping Holmes's hand with theatrical enthusiasm. "To have the great detective himself upon our ghastly doorstep. You've come for the phantom, no doubt. Ghastly affair. But fascinating, isn't it? So precise. So poetic, even." Holmes offered a mild nod, saying little. Mr. Field, however, required no invitation to continue. He regaled us with a litany of theories, some absurd, some disturbingly plausible, drawing connections between mythic numerology, shadow societies, and operatic revenge. It became clear, in short order, that he was not merely chronicling the murders, but had developed a curious affection for their symmetry. "He sees himself as an artist," Field declared. "The sixth phantom, a master of his medium. That's why he leaves the cards. His signature." Holmes's expression remained inscrutable. "And artists," he replied at last, "are often known to return to their audience." Later that afternoon, we visited the first of the murder sites, a parlour flat on Pembroke Street, where the initial victim, Mr. Cyril Duncombe, had been found seated upright in his armchair, face turned toward the fireplace. The room had since been let to another tenant, but the layout remained untouched. Holmes requested permission to inspect the space and was granted it with some reluctance. He moved slowly, pausing before the hearth, then turning his gaze toward the far wall, where a narrow mirror hung high, just above head level. "Do you note it, Watson?" he asked quietly. "The angle. It reflects nothing." He was correct. The mirror faced a blank wall, positioned not for vanity or function, but as though its placement were incidental or symbolic. At the next two locations, a study, then a music room, similar anomalies presented themselves, mirrors turned inward, backward, or hung far above eye level. One was even wrapped in a thin veil of black cloth. "Stage dressing," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. I frowned. "But why mirrors?" "To remind the performer of his presence," he said, "or perhaps to confront the absence of one." At each site, he jotted down precise sketches and measurements. The killer, it seemed, had not acted in haste. Each scene was curated, not a crime of passion, but of design. It was at the final scene, Eliza Morton's room, where Holmes found what he later termed the pivot point of the entire case. He had revisited the space alone, requesting I remain with Mr. Field, whose excitable presence he deemed quite accurately an obstruction to clarity. When I joined Holmes an hour later, I found him crouched beside the corner of the writing desk, eyes fixed upon the floorboards with almost predatory stillness. "There," he said softly, pointing. I followed his finger to a faint discoloration near the leg of the desk, no larger than a thumbprint and glistening faintly in the light. Holmes dabbed it with a cloth, sniffed it once, and nodded. "Grease compound," he muttered. "Theatrical, not commercial, mixed with spirit gum, the kind used to affix facial prosthetics or false limbs." I blinked. "You believe he wore a disguise?" "I believe," Holmes said, rising to his full height, "that he wore many." It was a chilling thought. A man who altered not only his face, but his bearing, his voice, his very presence. Such a man could walk freely through any street, past any constable, and vanish without ever leaving. That evening, we returned to our rooms at the King's Arms Hotel, a modest establishment near the river, chosen for its anonymity rather than comfort. Holmes said little throughout our meal, speaking only to request additional ink for his fountain pen and the latest issue of The Stage, which the concierge procured with some difficulty. After supper, he seated himself before the fire and began pacing, hands clasped behind his back, murmuring phrases to himself with the rhythm of a man reciting a half-remembered soliloquy. "Not a pattern," I heard him whisper. "A performance. A mask beneath the mirror. And mirrors, always mirrors." I watched him for a time, noting the way his eyes moved, not with confusion, but with controlled anticipation, as if he saw the outlines of a shape still cloaked in fog. When I asked whether he suspected a particular man, he did not answer directly. "We are not seeking a brute, Watson," he said. "We are seeking a craftsman, and one whose greatest deception may lie not in what he alters, but in what he reveals." He paused, then turned toward the window, where the lights of the city glimmered through the pane. "I fear," he said, "that we are already part of the audience." And with that ominous sentiment, he returned to his desk, where he resumed his silent vigil, alone with the shifting theatre of his thoughts. It was shortly after breakfast, on the third morning of our stay in Manchester, that Holmes made a request so unexpected it gave me momentary pause. "You must stay with Mr. Dorian Field today," he said, folding a newspaper with deliberate care. "Observe him, nothing more. Speak little and record much." I looked up from my tea. "Field? But why?" "He plays the part of spectator too convincingly," Holmes replied. "His interest is not that of a journalist alone. There is a rhythm to his appearances, a choreography I find suspicious." I pressed for more, but he waved me off with characteristic economy. "I must pursue another line of inquiry, alone, if you please." And with that, he rose, donned his coat, and disappeared into the morning mist. Though I had often followed Holmes into far stranger roles, from drunken sailor to country parson, it was rare indeed that I was assigned to simply watch, yet I obeyed. The tone in his voice allowed no argument, and the glint in his eye spoke of threads not yet woven into his tapestry of logic. Thus began my reluctant vigil over Mr. Field, a man who, I would soon discover, relished proximity to darkness more than he rightly should. While I shadowed the journalist, Holmes made his way to a neglected quarter of the city, a place long past its prime, where broken gas lamps leaned like drunken sentries, and the wind carried the stale breath of old smoke and damp velvet. It was here, in a narrow row-house above a shuttered hat shop, that he found the man he sought, one Archibald Merryweather, once known on the London stage as the Protean Ghost. Merryweather, now stooped and yellowed with age, had once been famed for his capacity to become any man, any shape, any voice. His was an art both admired and feared, for he could vanish not by distance, but by transformation. Holmes posed as a theatrical enthusiast, preparing a paper on the lost arts of disguise. He inquired after gum adhesives, skin putty and spirit glue, as well as the proper method for applying stagecraft limp effects. Merryweather, flattered by the interest and evidently lonely for conversation, responded with growing animation. "There are but a handful, sir," he said, "who could do it well, and fewer still who could make a man believe he'd never seen them before." Holmes listened intently, his mind quietly fitting the pieces of the actor's vanished art to the murderer's living mask. Merryweather, once coaxed into reminiscence, proved a veritable archive of lost technique. He spoke of silken facial webs, weighted heels to simulate a limp, and the subtle use of lavender oil to dull the scent of adhesives. Holmes pressed him gently on the prevalence of such methods. "Rare these days," the old actor muttered. "A dying craft. The war has taken most of the good ones, and the stage, sir, no longer trains its ghosts. But a master? Oh, a master would leave no trace. He would become the man next to you, or the shadow on your wall. Holmes nodded, absorbing each word as one might absorb coordinates on a map. Before departing, he inquired whether Merriweather had heard of any such performer who had vanished from the circuit. Merriweather's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps," he said. "But if I have, sir, they've made it their purpose to be forgotten." It was all Holmes required to know. Meanwhile, I resumed my observations of Mr. Dorian Field, and what began as reluctant duty soon evolved into quiet disquiet. The journalist was everywhere and nowhere. He appeared in alleyways before the constables arrived, at crime scenes hours after publication deadlines, and more than once I found him lingering outside the offices of the Herald, scribbling in a notebook, but never submitting copy. He questioned witnesses with an intensity that exceeded mere professional curiosity, and once, as I passed by unnoticed, I overheard him muttering dates under his breath, a rhythm of numbers that unnerved me. 6th, 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 2nd, 6th again. It was not his fascination that troubled me. It was his relish. He spoke of the killer with the detachment of an analyst, yes, but also with an admiration reserved for artisans. He had taken to referring to the murderer as the Phantom, even in casual speech, and seemed to savour each new development as though he were following an opera. When I later asked Holmes whether I ought to confront the man, he replied without looking up, "Not yet. The mask is still in place, but soon, Watson, it may slip." And with that, my dread deepened. That evening, returning from a late supper, I stepped into the hotel courtyard and glimpsed a figure hunched near the servants' hearth behind the kitchens. It was Mr. Field, his back turned, casting a furtive glance about him before thrusting a folded paper into the flames. I called his name, and he started visibly, as though a man caught red-handed. He straightened at once and smiled too quickly. "Ah, Doctor. Just disposing of some old notes. Nothing of consequence." I drew closer. The letter had burned nearly to ash, save for a single corner curling in the fire, enough to catch a glimpse of embossed parchment, the kind not used for drafts. "Strange," I remarked, "that you choose the scullery fire rather than your room." He shrugged. "Privacy's a rare thing in these walls. I prefer the certainty of flame to the guesswork of chambermaids." The answer rang hollow, but though I questioned him further, he offered no clarification, only a breezy deflection and a bid for good night. As he departed into the darkened hall, I felt a chill that the fire could not dispel. I resolved to mention the matter to Holmes the following morning, though I suspected he already knew. The next day, Holmes appeared in the lobby, dressed with quiet precision and bearing a folded telegram in his hand. He was calm, as ever, but there was a weight in his voice that turned every head in the room. "I should like this delivered to all major city papers," he told the hotel clerk, then turned to me. "Watson, prepare your notes. I shall be issuing a statement." Moments later, in the presence of a half-dozen reporters and constables alike, Holmes spoke with grave simplicity. "I believe," he said, "that another murder shall occur in 4 days' time, on the 6th of this month." The room fell into hushed stillness. Gregson, newly arrived, stared at him with furrowed disbelief. "On what grounds, Holmes?" Holmes met his eye. "On the only grounds that matter, Inspector. Design. This man is not erratic. He is composing a narrative, and the next act is imminent." "You're certain?" "I am never certain," Holmes replied. "But I am rarely mistaken." He refused further comment and withdrew, yet the effect was immediate. The press sprang to life, the constabulary doubled its presence, and the city's breath seemed to catch in its throat, as though awaiting a storm none could see, but all could feel. In the days that followed Holmes's pronouncement, Manchester transformed. It was not panic that took hold, nor chaos, but something quieter, more chilling. Expectancy. The sort of stillness one encounters before a curtain rises or a gun is fired. Shopkeepers closed early. Windows that once glowed with gaslight dimmed at dusk. Children were kept indoors, and whispers replaced conversation. The word phantom passed from lip to lip, always in a hush. I observed all this from my window at the King's Arms, where even the lamps seemed to burn lower, as if the city itself were reluctant to be seen. Each morning, Holmes emerged and vanished again, speaking little, eating less. He studied theatre posters, reviewed floor plans of closed music halls, and sent telegrams at odd intervals. Whatever path he was following, it bent toward an unseen precipice. Meanwhile, I continued my quiet surveillance of Mr. Field, whose behaviour grew more erratic with each passing hour. He paced the hallways like a man awaiting news of his own execution, or perhaps the completion of his masterpiece. On the eve of the 6th, as the city held its breath, Holmes finally returned to our room with a single, murmured phrase. "Now we shall see whether the actor forgets his lines." And with that, the final act drew near. The 6th of the month dawned under grey and oppressive skies, and all Manchester held its breath. Despite the vigilant presence of constables upon every street, the city had become a fearful place, wrapped in anxious silence. Yet for all their careful watch, the constabulary was powerless to halt the tragedy already written. Word reached us by noon. Lionel Vane, an elderly bookseller famed for his trade in rare and esoteric tomes, had been found dead in his cramped and dimly lit shop. His death was as silent and as grim as those that preceded it. Inspector Gregson himself delivered the news, his face pale and hollow. "We had men posted within sight of his door," he said, with quiet fury. "Yet somehow the fiend slipped through." Holmes made no immediate reply, but donned his coat with precise and deliberate calmness. Together, we accompanied Gregson to the scene, our arrival met by hushed murmurs and fearful glances from neighbours gathered outside the shop. Despite the bitter chill of the afternoon, I felt a colder dread seep into my heart as we stepped across the threshold. The phantom had struck again, seemingly unhindered by vigilance or caution, leaving behind only the familiar, terrifying signature of his craft. Inside the shadowed interior, the scene unfolded with a dread familiarity. Vane lay twisted upon the floor, his limbs arranged in a grotesque mimicry of rest. Upon his chest lay the now infamous token, the torn 6 of clubs, set with almost reverent care. Beside him stood a mirror, its glass fractured into jagged shards, glittering malignantly in the muted light. Gregson bent down, his hand trembling slightly as he retrieved the card. "The same again," he whispered hoarsely. "But why?" Holmes approached the shattered mirror with narrowed eyes, his slender fingers brushing lightly over the splintered edges. "Because it is integral to his performance," he answered quietly, more to himself than to Gregson. As I stood there, a shiver passed through me. Not from the chill of the shop, but from the realization that Holmes had long since moved beyond mere speculation. He now read this crime as clearly as a playwright might read his own script. Holmes's scrutiny of the broken mirror was meticulous. He traced the fractures with patient fingers, peering closely, his expression darkening with thought. Finally, he turned to us with an intensity that I had seldom witnessed. "The mirror was not broken in a struggle," he declared firmly. "Observe the shards. The blow was dealt from within, outwardly. This is no haphazard violence. It is deliberate symbolism." Gregson stared blankly, his understanding lagging behind Holmes's insight. "Symbolism?" "Yes," Holmes repeated calmly. "The mirror represents duality, identity and illusion. Breaking it from within suggests the killer views himself trapped inside the performance he has created, desperately trying to escape. It's not merely murder, gentlemen. It is theatre. Gregson, bewildered, glanced toward me as if seeking assurance. I could offer none, for I found myself equally astonished by Holmes's unsettling interpretation and the dark metaphors woven into the crimes we faced. Holmes then stepped purposefully to the narrow window at the rear of the shop, which overlooked a gloomy alleyway. The glass was undisturbed, the frame tightly shut, but he knelt suddenly, his eyes keenly focused, and with the delicacy of a surgeon, he examined the dusty sill. Lavender, he murmured softly, drawing in the faint scent. He touched the wood and showed me his fingertip, a slight smudge, barely visible. Spirit gum adhesive once again. I drew closer. He descended from the rooftop, I ventured cautiously. Holmes nodded with grim satisfaction. Precisely. Entered and exited unseen, like a shadow on the stage. He has maintained the artifice from beginning to end, a performer skilled enough to play multiple roles. The implications were chilling. I glanced upwards involuntarily, imagining our foe silently traversing rooftops, invisible to patrolmen below. Holmes rose slowly, his features set and determined. We are hunting neither brute nor madman, Watson. We are hunting a ghost, one that moves unseen and thrives upon illusion. That evening, as twilight descended and street lamps flickered uncertainly to life, Holmes called together the assembled police and journalists in the lobby of our lodging. His presence commanded immediate silence. Gentlemen, he began evenly, the murders that have haunted this city were never about calendar dates or numerology. They have always been theatrical, a staged performance meticulously planned and executed. Each murder represents an act within a grim play. A murmur rippled through the assembly, but Holmes continued undeterred, his voice gaining quiet authority. The killer is not simply choosing random victims. Rather, each death corresponds to an act from a forgotten Victorian drama, one titled The Sixth Sin, whose primary motifs were playing cards, mirrors, and hidden identities. The murderer's intentions are neither political nor personal vengeance, but psychological symbolism and dramatic exhibition. His words struck deep, and I saw Gregson's expression shift from skepticism to disquieted realization. Holmes concluded with steely calmness. This is not an end. It is a midpoint, part of a crescendo. The final act is yet to be staged. Our adversary remains hidden in the wings, awaiting his final cue. The room remained utterly still, spellbound by Holmes's haunting prophecy. Even as he turned and ascended the staircase, his words echoed ominously in our collective minds, magnifying rather than dispelling the fear that had gripped the city. The morning editions of every newspaper carried Holmes's grim prediction. Manchester awakened to fear, amplified tenfold. Streets emptied, commerce slowed, and whispers proliferated like a contagion of dread. The sixth phantom had now become a spectre haunting every home. Yet, amidst this public storm, I found myself privately troubled. Holmes's logic, usually crystal clear and luminous to me, now seemed opaque and troublingly abstract. The theatrical metaphor felt elusive, uncertain, even unsettling. Holmes, I ventured carefully as we sat alone later that day, forgive my hesitation, but are we certain this dramatic theory is correct? He regarded me evenly, his grey eyes unblinking. Certainty, Watson, is never truly achievable, but probability, logic, those are my trade. Every element we have uncovered, mirrors, grease paint, lavender, broken glass, each points unerringly to the stage. I nodded slowly, but my uncertainty remained evident. He noted my expression and softened slightly. You doubt me, old friend? No, I protested quickly. Never doubt. Merely, I struggle to grasp this killer's mind. He smiled faintly, a rare gesture of warmth amid our grim circumstances. Then consider this. The stage itself is a mirror. Our villain is performing not merely for others, but for himself. He has become both audience and actor, victim and villain. The lines separating reality and illusion have blurred beyond recognition. I accepted his explanation, though deep in my heart the unease lingered. For the first time, the logic that defined Holmes's genius had led me not into illumination, but into a deeper and darker uncertainty. Late that night, with Manchester's lamps burning low and the city hushed beneath the shadow of dread, Holmes paced thoughtfully by the hearth in our rented rooms. His hands clasped behind his back, his grey eyes gleamed with restless intellectual vigour, and I knew well the signs that heralded a significant revelation. "Consider it carefully, Watson," he began quietly. 6 murders, each aligned to subtle theatrical motifs, cards, mirrors, and careful disguise. What if our man is not driven by mere madness, but by methodical design, a narrative scripted and staged to perfection? A scripted narrative, I echoed, perplexed. Precisely, Holmes replied, halting in mid-stride. Our adversary is enacting scenes from an obscure Victorian drama, a forgotten play titled The Sixth Sin. I encountered references in Merriweather's collection, a melodrama of obsession and identity condemned to obscurity after its London debut. And this phantom, a stage actor himself, I surmise, one driven to madness, perhaps by failure or disgrace. He has adopted the role of avenging angel or vengeful phantom, exacting twisted justice upon symbolic victims. But why this specific play? Holmes smiled faintly, a bitter gesture devoid of mirth. Because, Watson, for him the drama never ended. The final curtain fell publicly, but privately his performance continued, evolving into lethal theatre. He is lost in the role, trapped within the narrative he himself created. The thought was chilling, and as Holmes turned again toward the fire, I shuddered involuntarily. The phantom was now more terrifying than any madman, for he was both playwright and executioner, blending illusions seamlessly with reality. Holmes paused briefly, then approached the desk, retrieving his notes. Yet why deviate at the 6th victim, Eliza Morton? Why disturb his meticulous pattern? I shook my head, unable to fathom the puzzle. Because she posed a risk, Holmes continued gravely. Through discreet inquiries today, I confirmed that Eliza had once worked backstage at an abandoned theatre, the Hollow Crown. Before nursing, she had briefly been a seamstress there, unnoticed but observant. Then she might have recognized the killer? I ventured. Exactly, Holmes confirmed. She inadvertently glimpsed the actor behind his mask, threatening the integrity of his carefully scripted illusion. He broke his sequence, abandoning artistic symbolism for practical survival. I felt a pang of sympathy for Eliza, this unwitting casualty of sinister theatrics. Holmes's deduction illuminated not only the method, but also the ruthless calculation beneath the killer's madness. The Hollow Crown, I murmured softly, unease tightening my chest. Then the past and present are intertwined more closely than we suspected. Holmes nodded slowly. Indeed, the killer's origin lies within those shadows, Watson, and that decayed theatre is where we must seek the truth. And ultimately, the man himself. Holmes now spoke with a clarity born of confidence. Consider, Watson, how swiftly and silently Eliza Morton was dispatched. No struggle, no screams. Why? Because she recognized her murderer not as a stranger, but as someone trusted, a known actor backstage, someone familiar enough to lull her suspicions. I nodded grimly. Thus silencing her became necessary to protect the killer's true identity. Precisely, Holmes continued. The act of murder became his ultimate performance, executed swiftly, methodically, and silently. There was neither passion nor hesitation, only precision. The gravity of his words settled heavily upon me. Then he continues this performance not merely from madness or artistry, I murmured, but from the absolute necessity of concealing his past. Holmes inclined his head, eyes sharp with satisfaction. You perceive clearly, Watson. He believes himself invisible within his roles, shielded by the anonymity of grease paint and theatrical illusion. And it is precisely this belief, this arrogance, that we must now exploit. His voice lowered, edged with solemn resolve. We must draw him forth, Watson. His stagecraft has shielded him thus far, but now it shall betray him. Thus resolved, we set out discreetly the following evening to examine the Hollow Crown Theatre. It stood forlorn and abandoned, its once grand facade crumbling, haunted by ghosts of past applause. Holmes stepped carefully through debris and fallen curtains, his keen eyes taking in every detail. He examined trapdoors beneath the stage, hidden passages connecting the wings, and rotting dressing rooms filled with cracked mirrors and dusty costumes. His manner was careful yet purposeful, reading the shadows like pages from a manuscript. Observe carefully, he instructed quietly, tracing his fingers along concealed doors and hidden panels. This theatre itself is an actor, Watson, capable of deception, secrecy, and disguise. It is the perfect lair for our killer, providing ready access and ample concealment. Each step through the ruin deepened my dread. This forgotten playhouse, I realized, was not merely an empty building. It was the heart of a terrifying narrative. Holmes stood center stage, silently considering the dusty seats arrayed before him. It is here, Watson, he murmured softly, that our final act must unfold. Here we will end his murderous performance, once and for all. The next morning, Holmes dispatched an anonymous review to the local papers, crafted with deliberate and clever provocation. It lavishly praised the brilliant revival of The Sixth Sin, extolling the artistic genius behind the masterful performances, and concluding with an invitation. Those who truly appreciate theatre should correspond promptly to share in the artistry behind the illusion. His purpose was evident. He had thrown down a gauntlet that our phantom, driven equally by vanity and obsession, would find irresistible. Will he answer? I questioned cautiously. Holmes merely smiled faintly. He cannot resist applause, Watson, even imagined applause. The actor's vanity, his hunger for recognition, will draw him forth. Sure enough, the paper circulated throughout Manchester. Public curiosity blossomed anew. Holmes waited, patient and untroubled, assured in the psychology of his quarry. We passed the day in tense silence, the weight of expectation pressing down upon our vigil. Yet Holmes remained calm, unflappable, fully prepared for the phantom's inevitable response. His faith was justified the very next morning when a letter, addressed only to the appreciative critic, arrived. The script was elegant and slightly theatrical, penned with flourish upon cream paper. Your perception of true theatre pleases me. Meet tonight where the curtain never fell, the Hollow Crown. Come alone, and prepare to glimpse the performance behind the mask. Holmes read it silently, then handed it carefully to me. I shivered involuntarily at the cryptic wording, knowing full well its sinister intent. Do you mean to go alone? I asked anxiously. Holmes's eyes hardened slightly. Indeed, alone, but you and Gregson must remain nearby, out of sight. Our foe must believe his conditions are met fully. His arrogance will then compel him to reveal himself. I nodded gravely. And if he anticipates a trap? Holmes allowed himself a faint sardonic smile. He anticipates theatre, Watson, not defeat. His vanity is our greatest ally. He believes he directs this play entirely. We must let him hold that illusion until the last possible moment. I could find no argument against Holmes's reasoning. though my own heart filled with apprehension at the thought of his vulnerability. Still, the plan was set, and I knew Holmes well enough to trust his judgment completely, even in the face of peril. That night, Holmes prepared meticulously. As Gregson and I concealed ourselves just outside the Hollow Crown stage door, Holmes entered alone. Calm and precise, he walked purposefully onto the darkened stage, stepping confidently into the shadows. The theatre was silent, oppressive with unseen menace. As Holmes vanished within, I felt a tightening dread, aware that we had entered the climax of a drama, whose outcome remained utterly uncertain. Yet Holmes seemed utterly unperturbed. His demeanour revealed neither fear nor hesitation, but rather a sharp and eager anticipation. For Holmes, this was the culmination of a cerebral duel, a game of intellect, courage, and control. Gregson touched my arm reassuringly, but my heart continued pounding. Inside, Holmes had taken his place upon the phantom stage, the final act beginning to unfold around him. We waited in breathless silence, hoping against hope that Holmes's deduction was not only accurate, but swift enough to preserve his life. Holmes stepped boldly across the threshold into the oppressive darkness of the Hollow Crown Theatre, vanishing instantly into a deeper shadow that clung to its walls. Gregson and I remained concealed outside, breathlessly awaiting Holmes's signal. Yet even from without, the silence of that derelict stage seemed palpable, a living force that consumed sound, hope, and courage alike. Inside, Holmes later recounted, the theatre had become a realm of ruin and memory, a ghostly tribute to forgotten applause and faded triumphs. The air was thick with dust and mildew, and the faint scent of lavender haunted the stale atmosphere, an unsettling reminder of the killer's presence. Holmes moved cautiously through fallen velvet curtains and tattered backdrops, each step stirring ancient dust. He paused momentarily, centre stage, listening keenly, senses attuned to the slightest disturbance. It was then, as he later confessed to me, that he felt most keenly the burden of his role, not merely detective, but audience, actor, and playwright in this grim production. The theatre waited expectantly around him, poised in sinister anticipation. Holmes, calm and resolute, faced the unseen threat as though merely another scene in a play whose outcome was never truly in doubt. From within the shadows, footsteps echoed softly, precise and confident. Holmes turned deliberately toward the sound, unmoving, prepared. A figure slowly emerged, illuminated dimly by the pale moonlight filtering through broken windows above. Inspector Mallory, but now stripped of his uniform and bearing the unmistakable garb and demeanour of a tragedian. His expression was intense, his gaze fixed unerringly upon Holmes. "Welcome," he spoke at last, his voice deep and resonant, far removed from his previous curt tones at the police station. "At last, an audience worthy of my performance. Inspector Mallory, or should I say, Arthur Marlowe," Holmes responded evenly, betraying neither fear nor surprise. A twisted smile curved Marlowe's lips. "Inspector Mallory was merely another role. One must adapt, Mr. Holmes, especially when reputation is lost and the stage rejects you. But here," he gestured dramatically to the crumbling theatre, "the true art continues," Holmes observed quietly, letting Marlowe's madness unfold. "I was London's greatest tragedian," Marlowe continued, bitterness flickering through his eyes. "But the critics, the cowards, stripped away my name, my honour. So I crafted a new drama, a drama of truth, of judgment, and of punishment." Holmes, unflinching, nodded subtly. "And your murders, mere acts in this vengeful theatre?" Marlowe bowed mockingly. "Precisely, Holmes. Each life a stage, each death a performance. Tonight, you shall witness the final act and understand the price of cowardice." Marlowe stepped forward, eyes ablaze with an unhinged fervour, His voice rose in cadence, as though performing before an unseen audience. "You see, cowardice is humanity's sixth sin, Mr. Holmes, a hidden vice, unacknowledged but rampant. Each victim I chose had failed when confronted by fear, betrayers, deceivers, all fleeing from truth. My murders were a purification, an artistry of justice." Holmes regarded him carefully, speaking softly but firmly. "And Eliza Morton?" "She alone recognized you behind your mask." Marlowe's face twitched, momentarily breaking character, eyes flickering with anger and pain. "A tragic necessity," he hissed. "Her recognition would have destroyed the performance, ended my righteous crusade prematurely. Her silence was my salvation, and her death my redemption." Holmes shook his head slowly, a subtle but unmistakable rebuke. "A cruel illusion, Marlowe. You have merely painted madness as virtue and murder as justice." Marlowe's expression twisted violently, revealing beneath his theatrical grandeur the cracked mask of instability. He stepped closer, voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You disappoint me, Holmes. I had hoped you would understand, appreciate the purity of my art, but no matter. All great tragedies end in blood." Before Holmes could respond, Marlowe lunged suddenly forward, revealing a dagger hidden within his sleeve. His voice rose sharply, screaming lines from Shakespeare in frenzied anguish. "Blood will have blood, they say. Blood will have blood." Holmes, alert and swift, stepped aside just in time, narrowly avoiding the deadly blade. Marlowe pivoted, eyes wild, consumed utterly by his role, by fury and madness. Gregson and I, concealed behind the stage curtain, needed no further prompting. We leapt forward as one, catching Marlowe from behind, wrestling him away from Holmes and pinning him firmly to the creaking stage floor. Marlowe struggled violently, roaring out tragic verse and curses, dagger clattering uselessly away. "Cowards!" he shrieked, spittle flecking his lips. "You betray the art, the truth. The sixth sin claims you all." Holmes stepped back into view, unruffled, calmly straightening his coat. "It is finished, Marlowe," he stated softly, pity evident beneath his sternness. "Your drama ends tonight." Marlowe continued thrashing weakly beneath us, then gradually subsided, his struggles fading into breathless sobs. His eyes rolled upward, searching frantically for comprehension, for reason, but finding only madness reflected back. Gregson bound him securely, his own expression shaken, and we rose slowly, the echo of Marlowe's tragic wails still reverberating throughout the empty theatre. As we stood over him, Marlowe's rage ebbed away, leaving behind only shattered fragments of sanity. He wept openly now, his face a mask of anguish, regret, and confusion. His voice fluctuated wildly, laughter mingling grotesquely with choking sobs, monologues shifting seamlessly from Shakespearean tragedy to personal remorse. "Who am I?" he whispered brokenly. "Marlowe? Mallory? Or neither? What role have I played? What lines spoken?" He stared blindly into the distance, trembling uncontrollably, now only a pitiable ruin of the commanding figure he had presented moments before. The actor, trapped irrevocably within his role, was now incapable of discerning performance from reality. Holmes watched soberly, pity rather than triumph etched upon his features. Quietly, he turned toward me, murmuring in solemn reflection, "The most tragic of all roles, Watson, is the one from which an actor cannot escape." The constables arrived soon after, removing Marlowe gently but firmly, yet the echo of his madness lingered, haunting the silence long after his departure. As Holmes stepped toward the stage door, I followed silently, unable to shake the oppressive weight of sorrow and horror intertwined, an unforgettable glimpse of the thin veil separating genius from madness. As the train carried us back to London, the journey was marked by a heavy silence, both of us lost in thought. The fog outside, seemed as though it had settled into our bones, reflecting the weight of the case that had now reached its dark conclusion. Even Holmes, usually so resolute and quick to speak, sat with his gaze distant, his brow furrowed in quiet contemplation. I watched him intently, still amazed by his calm, his unparalleled ability to navigate the human psyche and unravel the darkest corners of the mind. Yet beneath that calm exterior, I sensed the faintest shadow of something heavier. Perhaps it was the gravity of the mind he had just unraveled, or the unspoken sorrow for the tragedy that had unfolded. Both the crimes and the loss of a man who had once been a great actor but was ultimately consumed by his own madness. When we arrived at Baker Street, the stillness of our return mirrored the unease that lingered within me. The following evening, as we sat in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street, Holmes began his meticulous review of the case. He pored over the clues, as one might study the scattered pages of an unfinished manuscript, each element part of a larger puzzle, waiting to be pieced together. His voice, calm and assured, broke the silence as he began speaking. "The mirror," he began, tapping his fingers lightly upon the arm of his chair, "was the first indication of the deception. It appeared in every crime scene, an odd detail, yes, but one that revealed much once its true significance was understood. Each victim, it seemed, had been positioned in front of it, except that the mirror was always at an angle, often tilted or turned. In this way, the killer controlled how they appeared to the world, and, symbolically, how they were seen in the eyes of others." He paused, eyes narrowing as he continued. "The grease, subtle but unmistakable, was theatrical makeup, left behind as a signature, and the limp," he added, his gaze flicking toward me, "was no simple flaw of the body, but rather part of the persona the killer had adopted. His words were sharp and deliberate, and the connections he drew were simple in retrospect, but profound in their implication. The lavender," he said softly, "was the final piece, a scent used in the theatre to mask the smell of grease paint. It was a world he knew well, and it was this world that he wove into his murders." As Holmes leaned back, his voice trailing into silence, I could not help but reflect on how seamlessly the layers of illusion had come together, like the brushstrokes of a master painter who knew exactly where to place each stroke to form the complete image. Holmes, as was his custom, turned his piercing gaze upon me, a glimmer of something I could not immediately place in his eyes. For a moment he seemed to weigh his next words carefully before speaking. "You were right, Watson," he said, his tone soft but full of the authority I had come to expect from him. "Your suspicion of Mr. Field, though misdirected, played a critical part in the unravelling of this case." I blinked, surprised. My initial distrust of Mr. Field had seemed a mere whim to me, a fleeting thought, but Holmes's acknowledgement of it now felt like a strange vindication. I could not imagine how my actions, if they could be called such, had contributed to the outcome. "You see," Holmes continued, "your observations forced the killer to act before he was ready. His impulse to silence the one who might have recognized him accelerated the pace of his unravelling. It may have very well prevented another death. Sometimes, Watson, it is the smallest disruption in the web that brings down the entire structure." I sat silently for a moment, pondering his words. The puzzle had indeed been a delicate one, and I could not deny that the rapid pace at which the case had unfolded seemed almost too swift, too perfect in its culmination. Holmes settled deeper into his chair, his gaze distant, as though seeing something far beyond the walls of our sitting room. "You know, Watson," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective, "Marlowe's tragedy is one of self-destruction. His was a mind that had been consumed by its own illusions. He was never able to escape his role." I leaned forward, eager to hear more. Holmes paused, the firelight flickering across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his expression. "He believed," Holmes continued, "that in performing his role, his twisted play of justice. He was somehow cleansing the world, but in truth, he had become the very thing he sought to punish. His obsession with the sixth sin blinded him to the reality that he was no longer an actor, but a murderer. Holmes's voice dropped even lower, his words carrying a weight I had not yet fully understood. When the mask becomes the face, Watson, the stage consumes the man. Marlowe could not distinguish where the performance ended and where the reality began. His madness was not that he acted, but that he never knew when the curtain fell. I sat back, struck by the finality of his statement. Holmes, as ever, had seen through the layers of artifice to the tragic truth beneath, a truth that, for Marlowe, would never be untangled. As we sat before the fire that evening, the heavy silence between us felt more like a reflection of the case we had just resolved than any mere absence of words. Holmes had resumed his usual posture, legs crossed, his fingers steepled in front of him, and I, as always, found myself keenly observing his every motion. It was then that, in a rare moment of introspection, he spoke. "There is, Watson," he began, his voice soft but laden with meaning, "no more dangerous illusion than the one we cast upon ourselves. We wear masks so frequently, so fervently, that they begin to slip beneath the surface of our very souls." He paused, his gaze distant, as though his words held a weight far beyond the confines of our conversation. Marlowe, he continued, his tone steady, was a man consumed by his role. It was not merely that he chose to act, it was that he allowed the character to become him, until the mask became his very face. The line between the man and the performance vanished altogether. I sat in quiet contemplation, feeling the truth of Holmes's words resonate in the still air. Marlowe had indeed worn his role as an actor so deeply that, in the end, he had ceased to be anything more than a tragic figure, a man who had lost himself entirely to his own creation. As the fire dimmed and the evening wore on, I closed the case file before me with a solemn air. The weight of the entire ordeal seemed to settle heavily in the room, despite the absence of words between us. Holmes had spoken his piece, and now I too felt the quiet magnitude of what had transpired. "Marlowe's name," I said softly, "will soon fade from the public's memory. His madness, his tragic descent into delusion, will likely become little more than a forgotten footnote in the annals of crime. But Holmes, the shadow he cast will remain, unseen, unspoken, lingering in corners we cannot always reach." Holmes nodded, his sharp mind already engaged in thoughts beyond our discussion, but I could sense his agreement, even if it was unsaid. Marlowe's twisted sense of justice had come to an end, but something of the phantom he had created would remain, a spectre, lingering long after the curtains had fallen. As I sat in the quiet of our Baker Street sitting room, Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled before him, his eyes thoughtful. "It is not the role itself, Watson, but the depth to which one sinks into it that condemns a man," he said softly. Marlowe became the mask he wore, losing all sight of himself. His tragedy, Watson, was not just his crime, but the way in which he blurred the line between justice and performance. His words lingered in the air, and I could not help but ponder the perilous nature of self-deception. How often we wear masks, not realizing the true cost of becoming them. As I reflected on his words, I asked, "What do you think was Marlowe's greatest mistake? Was it his obsession with the theatre, or was it something deeper?" I would be most curious to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. And if you found this case as compelling as I did, please consider subscribing for more of Sherlock Holmes's most intricate mysteries. Don't forget to share the tale with others, for there are always more questions to be solved in the world of deduction.